It was a quiet neighborhood, peaceful and serene, until the rains came. What should have been just another storm turned into a nightmare that no one saw coming. The HOA, the very group that was supposed to protect and maintain the community, made a decision that would forever change everything. They decided to tear down the dam that had been holding back floodwaters for decades, all for the sake of improvements they thought were needed. But little did they know, this was a move that would lead to disaster. When the rainy season arrived, the skies opened up, and the waters began to rise. The dam that once held the floodwaters at bay was now gone, and the community was exposed. What followed was catastrophic. Streets flooded, homes were destroyed, and lives were turned upside down in a matter of hours. People lost everything, memories, belongings, even their homes. And all the while, the HOA seemed oblivious to the consequences of their actions. But here's the twist. The destruction didn't just stop with the flood. As the water receded and the damage became clear, the community found themselves fighting not just nature, but a battle against the very organization meant to protect them. What happened next was even more shocking. As the floodwaters began to recede, the full scale of the devastation became clear. Homes that once stood proud and secure were now submerged, their foundations eroded away. Families had lost everything: furniture, keepsakes, and even the lives they had built in that community. What was once a safe, close-knit neighborhood was now a war zone, with debris scattered across streets and yards turned into lakes. But while residents were struggling to come to terms with the damage, they started to notice something unsettling. The HOA had vanished. Not a single representative was to be found. Residents who had previously attended HOA meetings, trusting the group to act in their best interest, were now left wondering how it all went so wrong. Had they been misled? Were they lied to? There were whispers around town, stories from neighbors who had been part of the decision-making process. Some claimed that HOA had been cutting corners for years, focused more on their own profits than the safety of the people they were supposed to protect. Others suspected that HOA had never fully understood the implications of removing the dam. But one thing was clear: the damage was done, and now the community had to pick up the pieces without the help of those who were supposed to protect them. And just when it seemed like things couldn't get worse, an unexpected phone call brought even more shocking news. The phone call came late one evening, its timing adding to the feeling of unease. Jane, a longtime resident and a mother of two, picked up the phone, her heart pounding as the voice on the other end revealed something that made her blood run cold. The HOA had sold the land where the dam once stood. It wasn't just a poor decision. It was a calculated move, one that benefited certain people on the board financially. The dam wasn't removed for improvements, as they had claimed, but to make way for a new development project. A high-end housing complex that would line the riverbanks, promising luxury living with an exclusive view. The revelation sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. Jane wasn't the only one who felt betrayed. Neighbors who had trusted the HOA, some for decades, now faced the chilling reality that they had been pawns in a game they never agreed to play. Yet, the anger wasn't just aimed at the board members who made the decision. It spread to everyone who had ever been involved in the HOA, whether they knew about the development project or not. And that wasn't the only mystery. Mark, an engineer who had worked in flood control systems for over a decade, couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. He had seen firsthand how a small change to a dam's infrastructure could cause irreparable damage. As the floodwaters began to drain, he started asking questions, digging into the records, trying to understand what had been done to the dam before it was removed. The answers, however, only led to more questions. Had the HOA cut corners in the removal process? Was the dam even properly decommissioned? And why was there no official record of an inspection before the demolition? Meanwhile, a group of residents, frustrated and feeling hopeless, began meeting in secret. They talked about suing the HOA, but no one knew where to start or how to take on such a powerful entity. The sense of helplessness grew, especially as the board remained unreachable. With every passing day, the tension in the community continued to build, and every person seemed to be staring into the abyss of their uncertain future. Little did they know, there was someone else watching all of this unfold, someone who had the power to change everything. But would they act in time? As the days dragged on, the community grew more desperate. The meetings became more heated, more frantic, and more personal. People who had once been neighbors, sharing casual greetings in the street, now avoided eye contact, their relationships fractured by the flood and the secrets that had been uncovered. Jane and Mark, along with a few others, had become the unofficial leaders of the resistance. They were determined to expose the truth, but as they dug deeper, the obstacles seemed to multiply. It wasn't just the lack of answers from the HOA that frustrated them. It was the whispers of corruption within the community itself. Mark had uncovered a pattern of suspicious financial transactions that seemed to lead straight to the HOA board members. Jane had heard rumors of an influential developer who was involved in the housing project. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that they were up against something much bigger than just an unfortunate decision. This was a network of power, greed, and deceit, one that had been operating under the radar for years. As if things weren't already tense enough, the weather had taken a turn. The forecast predicted another round of heavy rain, and the fear of another flood weighed heavily on everyone's mind. The community's remaining trust in the dam had been shattered, but with no alternative solutions in sight, the fear of what could happen next loomed over every conversation. Mark worked tirelessly with his team to create a temporary fix to divert the water, but it was a last-ditch effort that could easily fail. Then, one evening, just as the storm clouds began to gather, Jane received a call. The voice on the other end was familiar but unsettling. It was from someone on the inside, someone who claimed to know exactly what had happened to the dam. They promised to reveal the truth, but only if Jane agreed to meet them in person. The conditions were clear. They wanted her to come alone. It was dangerous, unpredictable, but this could be the break they needed. As Jane stood in the pouring rain that night, walking toward the meeting place, she couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible was about to unfold. The tension in the air was thick, and the storm overhead seemed to mirror the brewing conflict below. She had no idea who she could trust anymore, but she had no choice but to keep moving forward. If she didn't, the truth would remain buried, and the damage to her community could become irreversible. But just as she arrived at the meeting spot, the ground beneath her feet began to tremble, and the distant roar of rushing water echoed through the air. Something was happening, something that would change everything. The ground beneath Jane's feet rumbled again, stronger this time. A strange sense of dread washed over her as she looked around, trying to see through the curtain of rain and darkness. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she didn't take her eyes off the approaching shadows. Then, without warning, a flash of lightning illuminated the horizon, revealing what Jane feared most. The dam was failing. It wasn't just a crack in the structure, it was crumbling. The water was already starting to spill over the broken edges, rushing down toward the town with terrifying speed. In a split second, Jane realized the meeting, the phone call, it had all been a distraction. Someone, perhaps even the person she had been about to meet, knew the flood was imminent and had deliberately lured her into the storm. Panic surged through her as she tried to think, but the reality was sinking in. The community was about to face another disaster, one that could be even worse than the first. With the dam compromised, it was only a matter of time before the floodwaters would swallow everything in their path. Desperately, Jane dialed Mark, but the call went straight to voicemail. Her thoughts raced. Was he even safe? Where was everyone else? She needed to warn the neighborhood, but the storm had cut off power, and everything was plunged into darkness. All she could hear was the relentless sound of the river, now rising to levels she'd never seen before. Then, as if to confirm her worst fear, a message popped up on her phone. It was from an unknown number. "You're too late," it read. "The flood isn't the worst of it." The words sent chills down her spine. There was something else happening, something far more sinister than a natural disaster. Someone had orchestrated this, and now they were playing with people's lives. Jane's pulse raced as she looked back at the dam, the water churning beneath her feet. She couldn't stay there any longer. Without another thought, she sprinted back toward the town, her mind spinning. The stakes were no longer just about the HOA or the failed dam. It was a race against time, and someone was out there pulling the strings. But who and why? As she reached the edge of town, the first of the floodwaters hit, sweeping through streets like a tidal wave. Jane stumbled, barely keeping her footing as she tried to make it to higher ground. The roar of the water was deafening now, drowning out all other sounds. But in the distance, Jane thought she saw a figure, someone standing calmly by the riverbank, watching it all unfold. And then, as the floodwaters surged forward, the figure disappeared into the night. Jane pushed through the rising waters, the current growing stronger with every step. She didn't know how much longer she could keep moving, but she had no choice. Every instinct screamed at her to get to safety, but the thought of her neighbors, of the people she cared about, kept her moving forward. As she reached the town center, she spotted a group of residents scrambling to find higher ground. They were already evacuating, but it was clear that most of them were too late. In the chaos, Jane spotted Mark. He was shouting orders, directing people towards safety, his engineer's mind working in overdrive. She ran toward him, calling his name above the roar of the floodwaters. When he turned to her, his face was grim. "It's worse than we thought," he said, pulling her aside. The dam wasn't just removed, it was sabotaged. The structural integrity was compromised long before the rains came. This wasn't an accident. Before Jane could respond, a voice cut through the air, calm and steady despite the disaster unfolding. Jane's heart skipped a beat as she turned to see the person who had been standing by the riverbank earlier. It was the same figure, drenched but unbothered by the rising floodwaters. The person stepped forward, revealing themselves to be none other than the HOA president, the very individual who had been at the heart of the decision to remove the dam. "You didn't think we would just let you stand in our way, did you?" The president said, a cold smile curling at the edges of their lips. This was never about the community. It was about money. The flood wasn't the plan. But now we have the land. We have everything we need. Jane's blood ran cold as she realized the depth of the betrayal. The flooding wasn't just collateral damage, it was intentional. The HOA had set this entire disaster into motion to clear the land for development, and the destruction was part of the plan to force the residents out. The sabotage wasn't a simple mistake. It had been orchestrated from the start. But just as Jane's mind was reeling from the shocking revelation, Mark stepped forward. "You think you've won, don't you?" he said, his voice steady despite the storm around them. "You've underestimated us. We've already notified authorities. This flood wasn't just a tragedy, it's a crime. And when the waters recede, you won't be able to hide what you've done." For a moment, there was silence. Then, the HOA president's face twisted into an expression of frustration. "You think anyone will believe you?" they sneered. "You're just a few disgruntled residents. Against us, you have no power." But as the floodwaters surged higher, drowning the streets in front of them, Jane realized something. The waters weren't just taking the town, they were taking away the president's grip on control. The storm was an equalizer. And in the end, no amount of money or power could stop nature's fury. As the president turned to leave, a police siren sounded in the distance. The authorities had arrived. Jane, Mark, and the remaining residents could finally breathe a sigh of relief, knowing that the fight wasn't over. They'd lost so much, but they had won the first round. Just as the police moved in to arrest the HOA president, Jane's phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from the mysterious insider who had reached out earlier. "You don't know the whole story yet," the message read. "There's more to the conspiracy. You've only uncovered the surface." Jane stared at the screen in disbelief. Even with the HOA president being arrested and the floodwaters finally beginning to recede, something told her that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of an even bigger mystery, and she was right in the middle of it. As the police took the HOA president into custody, Jane felt a strange mixture of relief and lingering uncertainty. The community had been through hell, but the storm was finally over. Mark and the others worked tirelessly to help with the cleanup, and though the damage was extensive, there was a sense of unity among the residents. They had come together in the face of disaster, and now they were rebuilding, not just their homes, but their trust in one another.